Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, get comfortable. Maybe lower the brightness on your screen, put your phone face down on the nightstand, or just let it sit there glowing quietly like a medieval candle you forgot to blow out. This is one of those nights where nothing urgent is happening. Nobody needs you. History has already happened. You can just lie there and listen. Tonight, we're talking about medieval people who were punished for crimes that technically did not exist yet, which sounds impossible and unfair and deeply medieval, because of course it was. This is not a story about dramatic trials or shocking executions or crowds screaming for blood. That stuff exists, but we're not doing that tonight. This is about the slower, quieter kind of injustice. The kind that happens because nobody bothered to define the rules, or because someone powerful suddenly decided the rules had changed, or because a judge woke up cranky and thought, this feels illegal now, so let's ease into it. No chapters, no structure, just drifting from one unfortunate life to another, watching people get punished for things nobody had technically outlawed yet. Which honestly is the most medieval concept imaginable. Let's start gently with the medieval understanding of law itself, because this is important. In the Middle Ages, law was less of a solid book and more of a vague suggestion. There were customs, traditions, things your grandfather said were wrong, things the local lord disliked personally, and then there were laws written down somewhere in Latin that nobody could read, including the people enforcing them. So already, we're off to a great start. In many medieval societies, a crime didn't need to be clearly defined. It just needed to feel wrong, or suspicious, or inconvenient. If something disturbed the social order, or embarrassed someone important or made people uncomfortable, it could quietly become punishable. Not illegal exactly, just unacceptable now. Because why not double down? Take, for example, medieval heresy. Early on, heresy wasn't even clearly defined. There was no official list of forbidden beliefs. People were punished not for breaking laws, but for believing the wrong thing too early. A belief might be tolerated for decades, even centuries, until suddenly it wasn't. And then, retroactively, everyone who had ever held it was now a problem. Imagine being a medieval peasant who casually believed something your village priest mentioned once. Something vague, something half understood. Maybe you believed saints worked a certain way, or that prayer functioned like a transaction, or that God preferred local customs over official doctrine, and then one day the church decided actually no. And now your belief had a name, and that name was heresy. Congratulations, you were wrong before it was wrong. Of course nobody explained this to you. There was no announcement, no memo nailed to the church door saying, hey, starting this year this belief is illegal. You just found out when someone asked a few pointed questions, and then things got quiet, and then things got uncomfortable, and then you were punished for holding an idea before it was classified as a crime. This happened constantly. Early religious movements often weren't illegal until they gained enough followers to become annoying. Once they did, they were retroactively reframed as dangerous. And suddenly, people who had lived peacefully for years were now criminals, not because they had changed, but because the definition had. And the medieval system loved this kind of thing. It loved flexibility. It loved vague boundaries. It loved the ability to say, well, we didn't say it was allowed. Now let's drift over to something even more common. Witchcraft. Or rather, pre-witchcraft. Because for much of the Middle Ages, witchcraft as a legal crime didn't really exist in the way we imagine it today. Early medieval law codes often treated magic as nonsense, superstition, foolishness, sometimes a minor offence, sometimes not even that. And yet, people were still punished. There are recorded cases of medieval women being punished for maleficium before it was clearly defined, which is just a fancy way of saying bad stuff we don't like. no spell lists, no legal criteria, just vibes. And once the concept of witchcraft hardened into an official crime centuries later, it was retroactively assumed that these women had been guilty all along. History loves doing that. Let's slow down here, because this is important. Medieval punishment didn't require certainty. It required consensus. If enough people agreed that something was wrong, it became punishable, even if nobody could explain why. Especially if the person involved was socially vulnerable, especially if they were inconvenient. And this brings us gently to medieval morality crimes. Things like sexual behaviour, relationships, identity, choices. Many of these weren't clearly legislated for a long time, which didn't stop people from being punished for them anyway. Take adultery. In many medieval regions, adultery laws were inconsistent, vague, or non-existent. And yet people, mostly women, were punished constantly, not because a written law said so, but because the community felt betrayed, or embarrassed, or scandalized. A woman could be punished for behavior that wasn't technically illegal, simply because it disrupted social expectations. The law followed later, conveniently. Same with relationships that didn't fit neatly into church definitions. People were punished for partnerships that hadn't yet been classified as sinful in legal terms. Once the classification arrived, the punishments were seen as justified, even if they happened before the crime technically existed. And then there's blasphemy. Ah, yes. Blasphemy is a fun one. Early medieval blasphemy laws were wildly inconsistent. In some places it wasn't illegal at all. In others, it was vaguely frowned upon. In others, it depended on who heard you say it. There are cases of people being punished for irreverent speech long before blasphemy became a formal crime. People were fined, imprisoned, or ostracized for saying things that later generations would define clearly as blasphemy. But at the time, it was more like, we don't like that tone. Tone policing, medieval edition. And let's not forget treason. Treason is especially fun because medieval rulers were extremely creative with it. Early on, treason was often narrowly defined, plotting to kill the king, betraying him in war, that sort of thing. But rulers quickly realized that having a vague definition of treason was extremely convenient. So people were punished for treasonous behavior that wasn't technically treason yet, speaking critically, refusing loyalty enthusiastically enough, being related to someone suspicious, existing too close to power. Over time, treason laws expanded to cover these behaviors, and then historians looked back and said, well, clearly they were traitors, even though, at the time, the law hadn't caught up with the ruler's feelings, which brings us to medieval retroactive justice. Because yes, that was a thing. Medieval legal systems didn't always care about the idea that laws shouldn't apply backward. That concept came much later. In the Middle Ages, if something was wrong now, it was often assumed to have been wrong then. And punishment followed that assumption. This was especially common during political shifts. New rulers would redefine crimes. New religious authorities would redefine sin. And people who had lived comfortably under the old rules suddenly found themselves guilty under the new ones. Not because they had changed their behaviour, but because the moral goalposts had quietly moved. Imagine living your entire adult life doing something tolerated, accepted, maybe even encouraged, and then one morning it's condemned. And not just condemned going forward, condemned retroactively. As if you had always been wrong, as if you should have known. That was medieval life. And it wasn't just peasants. Nobles were punished too. Courtiers, advisors, clergy. People close to power often suffered the most from crimes that didn't exist yet, because proximity made everything more dangerous. A whispered accusation could become a crime simply because it needed to. We'll get to them later, slowly. No rush. For now, just sit with the idea that in medieval society, legality was flexible. Morality was negotiable. Let's keep drifting. Because once you realise that medieval law was more of a mood than a rulebook, you start seeing these almost not crimes everywhere. Little moments where someone's life quietly derailed because society hadn't decided yet what was allowed, but had definitely decided what felt wrong. One of the most uncomfortable examples is usury, lending money with interest. Today it's called banking. In the medieval world it was complicated. For a long time, charging interest wasn't clearly illegal everywhere. It was frowned upon, discouraged, sermoned against, but not consistently outlawed. And yet, people were punished for it constantly. Merchants, moneylenders, especially Jewish communities were fined, exiled, shamed, or stripped of property for engaging in financial practices that hadn't yet been formally criminalized. The logic was simple. We don't like this. So punishment came first. Legal clarity came later. And when usury laws were eventually written down, they conveniently aligned with punishments that had already been handed out. History nodded along and said, yes, this makes sense now. It always does. After the fact. And then there's dress. Medieval sumptuary laws, rules about what you were allowed to wear, are famous for being absurd. But what's less talked about is that for a long time they didn't exist yet. People were punished socially, financially, and sometimes legally for dressing above their station before there were actual laws against it. Imagine wearing a nice cloak. Not illegal, not forbidden, just ambitious. Maybe you're a merchant doing well. Maybe you inherited it. Maybe you just like the colour, and suddenly you're fined, or publicly shamed, or told to remove it. Not because a law said so, but because your clothing made someone uncomfortable. Later on, proper sumptuary laws were passed, and everyone pretended this had always been the rule. This happened a lot. The medieval world loved to enforce rules retroactively, especially when those rules protected hierarchy. And hierarchy was sacred. Now let's slide quietly into something even more abstract. Intent. Medieval people were often punished for intentions that weren't crimes yet. Thoughts, suspicions, possibilities. Someone might be dangerous. Someone could cause trouble. Someone feels like they're heading in the wrong direction. There are records of people being imprisoned or disciplined for potential heresy, suspected disloyalty, or improper tendencies. None of these were legal categories. They were pre-crimes, vibes-based justice, Minority Report but with candles. This was especially true during periods of religious reform. When doctrine was shifting, nobody was quite sure what counted as correct belief anymore, so people were punished for being too early, or too slow, or slightly out of sync. Being spiritually offbeat was dangerous. You didn't have to be wrong, you just had to be out of alignment with where authority was heading, which is deeply unfair and very medieval. Let's talk about women again. Because of course we are. Medieval women were punished constantly for crimes that hadn't been defined yet, especially around sexuality and independence. Take premarital relationships. In many regions, they weren't initially illegal. They were socially discouraged, yes, but not always punishable by law. That didn't stop punishments. Women were fined, expelled, forced into penance, or publicly humiliated for behaviour that hadn't yet been codified as criminal. Over time, laws caught up with the punishments, and once they did, earlier cases were reframed as moral corrections rather than legal overreach. Same thing with pregnancy outside marriage. Early medieval communities often treated it as a social issue rather than a crime. Then attitudes hardened, laws followed, and suddenly, women who had been punished years earlier were retroactively considered criminals, as if the law had always existed, as if their punishment had always been justified. History is very good at pretending things were always inevitable. Now let's gently pivot to something slightly absurd, medieval science, or what passed for it. People were punished for medical practices before those practices were officially condemned. Midwives, healers, herbalists. For centuries they operated openly. Then attitudes shifted. Suddenly their knowledge became suspicious, dangerous, maybe even supernatural. Women who had safely delivered babies for decades found themselves punished for methods that had never been illegal before, not because they changed, but because society's understanding did, and instead of admitting uncertainty, authorities punished familiarity. This is a recurring theme: punishment as a substitute for clarity, and then there's language. Medieval language laws were interesting. In many places, speaking certain languages or dialects wasn't initially illegal. It was just inconvenient for rulers, so people were punished for speaking their native tongue, fined, excluded from courts, denied rights. Not because a law said so, but because power preferred something else. Later, language restrictions were written into law, and again, history shrugged and said, well, obviously, as if generations of punishment hadn't already happened without legal backing. Let's pause here for a second, take a breath. This isn't meant to be stressful, it's meant to be numbing. In that gentle, late-night way where injustice feels distant and abstract, like rain against a window you're safely inside, because that's the rhythm of medieval life, slow, arbitrary, quietly cruel. Even children weren't spared. Medieval children were punished for behaviours that hadn't been defined as wrong yet. Concepts like juvenile responsibility didn't exist clearly. A child could be punished as an adult one day and treated as incapable the next, depending on convenience. Children were disciplined for crimes like disobedience, disrespect, or moral failure, none of which were legally defined. Punishments were handed down based on expectation, not law. Later, when legal systems matured, these punishments were retroactively framed as necessary moral education. Everything always sounds better in hindsight. Now let's drift toward the elite again. Because while peasants suffered quietly, nobles suffered interestingly. Courtiers were punished for political crimes that hadn't yet been named. Being on the wrong side of a faction before it was officially labelled treason. Supporting the wrong person too early, or too late. A noble might be stripped of titles or lands not because they broke a law, but because their loyalty became inconvenient. Later new treason statutes would be written that conveniently described exactly what that noble had done. History would then mark them as guilty. Case closed. And nobody asked whether the law existed at the time. That question didn't matter. This brings us to one of the most medieval concepts of all: collective punishment. People were punished for crimes they couldn't have known about yet, simply because they belonged to a group that would later be criminalized. Religious minorities, ethnic groups, political factions, entire communities were fined, expelled, or restricted before there were laws justifying it. The laws came later, the punishment came first, which is backwards, but also extremely efficient. By now you might be noticing a pattern. Medieval justice wasn't about rules, it was about maintaining order, and order didn't require consistency, it required compliance. Punishment was a tool to shape behaviour before the law caught up, and once the law arrived, it conveniently validated everything that had already been done. So when we look back and see medieval punishments, we often assume they were legal, structured, justified by codes. But so often, they weren't. They were improvisational, reactionary, emotional, later cleaned up by scribes and lawmakers who preferred their past to look orderly. It rarely was. Let's gently keep going. There's more, plenty more. No rush, we're just getting comfortable. All right, let's keep moving, slowly. No need to hurry anywhere. Medieval justice certainly didn't. One of the strangest things about being punished for a crime that didn't exist yet is that, very often, the person being punished never even knew what they were accused of, not in a clear way. There was no statute to point to, no definition to explain, just a vague sense that something about them had crossed an invisible line, and medieval society was full of invisible lines. Take reputation. Reputation itself wasn't a crime, there was no law against being suspicious, and yet people were punished relentlessly for having a bad name. If enough people whispered about you, about your behaviour, your family, your habits, you could be fined, excluded from community life, or denied legal protections. Not because you'd done something illegal, but because your reputation suggested you might. This is one of those moments where medieval law starts to feel uncomfortably modern. Preemptive punishment, risk management, social forecasting. Except instead of algorithms, it was just gossip and vibes. There are cases where people were punished for being habitually troublesome, which is not a crime, it's a personality description. But medieval courts didn't always care about that distinction. If someone felt like a problem, they were treated like one. Later on, legal systems would invent categories to justify this: disturbing the peace, disorderly conduct, moral corruption. But at the time, none of that was clearly defined. Punishment came first, vocabulary followed. Now let's talk about travel. Because medieval travel was surprisingly dangerous in a legal sense. Not because travelling was illegal, usually it wasn't, but because being somewhere you weren't expected to be could itself become suspicious. People were detained, questioned, fined, or expelled simply for moving around too much. Vagrancy laws didn't always exist yet, but people were punished as vagrants anyway. If you didn't have a clear reason to be somewhere, or a lord to vouch for you, your presence could be treated as a problem. Over time, vagrancy became a defined crime. And once again, earlier punishments were retroactively justified. It's almost comforting how predictable this pattern is. And then there's work. Medieval labour laws were a mess. Guild systems controlled trades, but for long periods, working outside a guild wasn't technically illegal. It was just unwelcome. So people were punished for practicing trades they weren't officially allowed to practice yet. Fined, shut down, sometimes physically removed. Later, formal laws would be written, but by then plenty of people had already lost livelihoods over rules that hadn't existed at the time. History tends to remember the laws, not the losses. Let's drift into something quieter now. Silence. Yes, silence. Because medieval people were sometimes punished for not doing things that hadn't yet been legally required. Not reporting neighbours, not denouncing heretics, not participating enthusiastically enough in public rituals. There are records of people being disciplined for failing to show sufficient zeal before such expectations were formalised. They weren't breaking a law, they were failing to anticipate one. And medieval authority did not appreciate a lack of anticipation. This was especially true during periods of moral reform, when rulers or church authorities decided society needed cleaning up. They often punished people first to set an example. The law would follow later. Because fear is an excellent motivator. Now let's talk about names. Actual names. Medieval people were punished for using names that later became associated with forbidden identities, religious names, cultural names, names linked to outlawed groups. At the time they were given those names, nothing was wrong with them. But once associations changed, people found themselves punished simply for being who they had always been. Changing a name wasn't easy. Records were sparse, memory was long, and suspicion stuck. Again, no crime existed at first, just discomfort. And discomfort was enough. One of the most unsettling examples of this phenomenon involves loyalty. Medieval loyalty was personal, not abstract. You were loyal to a person, not a state. When that person fell out of favour, your loyalty could suddenly look criminal. Even if it had been praised just days earlier, people were punished for supporting rulers, nobles, or religious figures who were later condemned. At the time of their support, there was no crime. In fact, it was often encouraged. But once power shifted, that same behaviour became suspect, then dangerous, then punishable, and new laws would be written to explain why those people had always been wrong. This is why medieval politics feels so exhausting. It required constant recalibration, and if you failed to recalibrate fast enough, you paid for it. Not because you broke the rules, but because the rules moved. let's gently talk about knowledge. Knowledge was dangerous in the Middle Ages, especially the wrong kind. But what counted as wrong changed constantly. Scholars, translators, and thinkers were punished for engaging with texts or ideas before those ideas were officially condemned. A book might be perfectly acceptable one year, suspicious the next, forbidden after that. People who had read it earlier were suddenly treated as if they had done something illegal, as if curiosity itself had a statute attached. This is especially true with translations. Translating religious texts into local languages wasn't always illegal. It became illegal later. People were punished for translations that had been tolerated, even encouraged, before authorities decided they didn't like where things were heading. Once again, punishment preceded prohibition. And then there's the medieval obsession with order. Social order, cosmic order, divine order. Anything that disrupted order, even accidentally, could be treated as criminal. People were punished for behaviours that were later defined as crimes against order. Unconventional family structures, unusual living arrangements, ambiguous social roles. But at the time, these weren't crimes. They were anomalies. And anomalies made medieval society deeply uncomfortable. So they were corrected, later explained. Officially condemned only after the damage was done. Let's pause again. Let the rhythm slow. This is a lot of quiet unfairness. But that's kind of the point. Medieval punishment wasn't usually loud. It was procedural, bureaucratic, justified by custom rather than clarity. Even death wasn't always necessary. Social death was often enough. Loss of status, loss of protection, loss of voice, being pushed just far enough out of the community that survival became difficult, and all of it could happen without a single law being broken. By the time legal systems became more formal, much of this behaviour had already been normalised. Punishment had shaped society before law ever caught up. So when laws finally appeared, they didn't feel new. They felt inevitable, and that's the most unsettling part. Not the cruelty, not even the injustice, but how natural it all seemed to the people living through it. No one thought they were doing anything unusual. They were just enforcing what felt right, what felt safe, what felt necessary, which is always how it starts. Let's keep drifting. There are still more lives caught in this fog, more quiet punishments waiting to be remembered. Let's keep going. Just let it roll on, like footsteps in a stone hallway that never quite echoes back. By now, it should be clear that medieval punishment wasn't really about action. It was about alignment, being aligned with the right beliefs, the right people, the right customs at the right moment. And if you fell out of alignment, even briefly, you could be punished for a crime that technically didn't exist yet, but emotionally very much did. One of the quietest examples of this is something medieval sources often call improper living, which sounds vague because it was. Improper living wasn't a crime. It wasn't defined. It didn't appear in law codes in any consistent way, and yet people were punished for it constantly. Being punished for how you lived rather than what you did. Living alone for too long. Living with someone you weren't related to in the correct way. Living too comfortably without an obvious source of income. Living too poorly despite having one. None of these were crimes, but all of them could trigger intervention, fines, forced relocation, public correction, sometimes imprisonment. Later on, authorities would invent clearer categories: vagrancy, immorality, disorderly conduct, to explain these punishments. But at the time, the crime was simply existing in a way that made other people uneasy. A medieval society was very easily uneasy. This is especially visible in how medieval towns treated newcomers. Migration wasn't illegal, but suspicion was automatic. People arriving without clear documentation, which barely existed, could be punished simply for not fitting in fast enough, not because a law required it, but because communities preferred familiarity over fairness. There are records of people being expelled, fined, or denied protection because they hadn't yet proven their moral reliability, which is not a crime, it's a waiting period. But medieval justice didn't love waiting, it loved action. Now let's drift towards something almost philosophical: destiny. Medieval people genuinely believed in fate, divine plans, cosmic order, which meant that when something went wrong, crop failure, disease, social unrest, someone had to be responsible, even if no crime existed yet to explain it. So people were punished for outcomes rather than actions. If something bad happened around you, and you were convenient, you might be punished simply for being nearby. Later, authorities would define crimes to justify these reactions: sabotage, moral corruption, hidden sin. But originally, the punishment came because something felt wrong, and someone had to absorb that feeling. This is particularly visible during famines and disasters. People were punished for hoarding before hoarding laws existed, for profiteering before price controls were formalized, for causing scarcity when no legal framework explained how scarcity even worked. Again, punishment first, definition later. Let's talk about obedience. Obedience itself wasn't always legally required in specific ways. But people were punished for insufficient obedience long before laws spelled out what obedience meant. Failing to kneel fast enough, failing to respond enthusiastically, failing to show the correct emotional reaction to authority. These weren't crimes, they were perceived slights, and medieval authority did not enjoy being slighted. Over time, rituals became codified, gestures became mandatory, failure to perform them became punishable by law. But for generations before that, people were already being disciplined for failing to meet expectations that hadn't yet been written down. Which makes you wonder how anyone ever felt safe. Now let's slow down and talk about marriage again, because medieval marriage laws were a moving target. Consent, age, ceremony, legitimacy, all of these concepts evolved over time. People were punished for marital arrangements that were considered valid when they occurred, but were later reclassified as improper or illegal. Couples who married privately, or according to older customs, found themselves punished when newer rules appeared. Their children might be declared illegitimate retroactively, their unions condemned after years of acceptance, not because they had broken the law, but because the law had changed its mind. This happened quietly, on paper, through church courts and local authorities who preferred clean categories over messy reality. And the people affected? They didn't get a redo. Let's talk about gender roles, because medieval punishment loved enforcing roles that weren't always clearly defined. Men were punished for not being masculine enough, women for being too assertive, but these expectations weren't laws, they were assumptions, cultural scripts, and deviation from them could trigger punishment even in the absence of any formal crime. Later, moral codes and legal texts would crystallize these expectations into clearer prohibitions. But long before that, people were being corrected, sometimes harshly, for failing to perform their assigned role convincingly enough. This is one of those areas where medieval life feels suffocating, not because of constant violence, but because of constant surveillance, social surveillance, emotional surveillance. Everyone watching everyone else, waiting for someone to slip. And slips didn't need to break laws, they just needed to disrupt comfort. Now let's drift into something almost tragic in its banality: paperwork. Medieval bureaucracy was limited, but what existed mattered. Being punished for failing to produce documents that didn't exist yet was surprisingly common. Proof of land ownership, proof of status, proof of permission. People were punished for lacking evidence of rights that had previously been assumed. As administration expanded, expectations changed, and those who couldn't meet new standards were treated as if they had always been in violation. No transition period, no grace, just consequences. This is especially visible in land disputes. Peasants lost land because they couldn't prove ownership in writing, ownership that had been recognised orally for generations. When documentation became important, the lack of it became punishable, not because anyone had done anything wrong, but because the system had changed. And then there's the church again, always quietly present. People were punished for failing to follow religious practices before those practices were universally mandated. Fasting rules, attendance expectations, confession routines. Someone might be punished for neglecting a ritual that wasn't yet required by law, simply because authorities wanted to encourage compliance. Later, when the requirement became official, earlier punishments were reframed as enforcement rather than experimentation. The medieval world loved to experiment on its people. By now, this might all feel repetitive, and that's okay. Repetition is the point, because this wasn't rare, it wasn't exceptional, it was normal. Being punished for something that hadn't yet been clearly defined as wrong was simply part of medieval life, and people adapted. They learned to watch closely, to anticipate changes, to read authority's mood, to stay as close to the centre as possible, or to disappear quietly when they couldn't. Some succeeded, many didn't. As we drift further into this long night, we'll start to see specific lives, faces, names, people whose stories survive just enough to remind us that behind every vague punishment was a real person, trying to guess the rules in a game that kept changing. No rush, we'll get there, just keep listening. Alright, this is where everything slowly comes together, not with a bang, not with a revelation, but with that very medieval realization that there was never going to be clarity. That was the system. Because the true climax of this story isn't one person, or one law, or one spectacular miscarriage of justice. It's the moment medieval society quietly decided that law would always follow power, never the other way around. And once you see that, every punishment that didn't quite make sense suddenly does. Let's ease into that. Toward the later Middle Ages, legal systems began to look more solid, more written, more official. Kings issued statutes, church councils produced lists, courts kept better records. On paper, things appeared to be improving. Crimes were being defined, procedures standardized. Justice, supposedly, was becoming more rational. But here's the uncomfortable part. When a crime was finally defined, heresy, treason, witchcraft, moral deviance, it was often framed as if it had always existed, as if people had always known better, as if earlier punishments hadn't been improvisations, experiments, or acts of fear. This is where the medieval world quietly absolved itself. Someone punished 20 years earlier for vague disobedience. Now they were retroactively guilty of sedition. A woman shamed for unconventional living. Now clearly immoral. A scholar silenced for curiosity. Obviously a heretic. The law arrived late, and then claimed it had been there all along. And this mattered deeply, because it allowed medieval authorities to sleep at night. To believe they had never acted unfairly, that they had only enforced eternal truths, that justice had always been on their side, which is, honestly, one of the most human lies imaginable. This retroactive moral certainty didn't just protect institutions, it shaped memory. Chronicles were rewritten, language adjusted, punishments reframed as warnings rather than mistakes. The ambiguity was sanded down. History became neater than reality ever was. And the people who had lived through the uncertainty, they didn't get footnotes. They just faded. This is the quiet tragedy at the centre of medieval punishment. Not the pain itself, but the way it was later justified, the way suffering became proof of guilt, rather than evidence of a system feeling its way blindly forward. People who had once been punished cautiously were now punished decisively. People once corrected were now condemned. The experimental phase was over. And here's the most chilling part. The earlier punishments, the vague ones, the unjustified ones, the ones for crimes that didn't yet exist, made the later ones possible. They prepared society, normalized obedience, taught people not to ask what law they had broken, but why authority was displeased. By the time laws became clear, resistance was tired. People had already learned the lesson. It didn't matter whether a crime existed. It mattered whether power wanted one. And so, the climax of this story isn't a courtroom or a scaffold. It's a mindset. A world where people stopped expecting rules to protect them, where survival meant anticipation, where safety came from staying unremarkable, quiet, aligned, where being right didn't matter nearly as much as being acceptable. This is why medieval people appear so passive in the records, not because they lacked intelligence or courage, but because they lived in a system where certainty was dangerous, where knowing the rules too clearly meant you might notice when they changed, and noticing that was risky. So people adapted, they softened, they complied, they disappeared into routines, into rituals, into silence, which brings us back to you, lying there, listening, safe in a world with written laws and expectations that, most of the time, don't shift overnight. Most of the time. The medieval world didn't collapse because of its injustice. It endured because of it. Because ambiguity kept everyone slightly off balance, slightly afraid, slightly unsure. And when crimes finally existed, clearly defined, clearly punished, most people didn't question them. They had already been punished without them. So if this story feels unsettling, that's okay. It's supposed to. Not in a loud way, just in that quiet late-night way where you realize history wasn't cruel because it was chaotic, but because it slowly convinced itself that chaos was order. And with that thought, you don't need to stay awake anymore. History will keep doing what it does. The past won't change, and you can let your eyes close. Hey guys, tonight let's slow things down a bit. Dim the lights, put your phone face down, let your brain gently power off like a medieval candle running out of wax. Tonight we're talking about insomnia, specifically what medieval people did when they couldn't sleep at night. Because believe it or not, lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling is not a modern invention. Medieval people did it too. They just didn't have TikTok, or podcasts, or the option to Google, "Why am I suddenly aware of my own heartbeat?" Instead, they had prayer and superstition and anxiety about demons. So, basically the same thing, just with fewer screens. Now, before we begin, a quick vibe check. This is not a story about terror or jump scares or medieval horror movie nonsense. This is about quiet nights, flickering candles, creaking floorboards, and a lot of people lying awake thinking about their sins. So get comfortable, because tonight we drift through dark castles, cold monasteries, and creaky peasant huts to see what people did when sleep simply refused to show up. And yes, of course they blamed God, and the devil, sometimes both, because why not cover all your bases? Now the first thing we need to understand is this. Medieval sleep was already weird. Very weird. They didn't sleep like we do. No neat 8-hour block. No sleep apps congratulating them with fireworks animations. Instead, most medieval people practiced what historians call segmented sleep, which is a polite academic way of saying they slept, woke up and then slept again. They would go to bed shortly after sunset, which, depending on the season, could be extremely early, like 7 p.m. early. Sometimes earlier. They'd sleep for a few hours, then they'd wake up, naturally, casually, not panicked. This middle of the night waking period was called the first watch and the second watch, and between them was a quiet liminal stretch of time known simply as the watch. And during the watch, people were awake, not wide awake, not caffeinated, just awake enough to exist. They might pray, they might talk quietly, they might stare into the darkness and think about how death is inevitable. Very soothing stuff. So in medieval society, waking up at night wasn't automatically a problem. It was expected, normal, almost cozy. But insomnia, the kind where sleep never comes, that was something else entirely. Because when medieval people couldn't sleep at all, they didn't think, must have had too much wine. They thought, something is deeply wrong with my soul, and that's where things get interesting. Let's start with the peasants, because they were tired, always tired, permanently exhausted, and yet, somehow, still awake at night. A medieval peasant's bed was usually a wooden frame if they were lucky, or just a raised platform. On top of that was a mattress stuffed with straw, or hay, or old leaves, or whatever was available and only mildly mouldy. Blankets were heavy, rooms were cold, animals often slept inside the house, sometimes on the bed, so if you were lying awake at night you were doing so next to a goat, or a pig, or at the very least the lingering smell of livestock. And when peasants couldn't sleep, the first response was prayer. Always prayer. Short prayers. Long prayers. Memorized prayers. Improvised prayers. Prayers whispered. Prayers muttered. Prayers half forgotten, because exhaustion was winning the argument. They believed sleeplessness could be caused by sin. Not a specific sin necessarily, just vibes. Maybe you lied earlier that day. Maybe you thought something impure. Maybe you forgot to say grace before dinner. God noticed, and now here you are, awake, deservedly. So you prayed. You confessed silently. You promised to be better tomorrow, which statistically you would not be. If prayer didn't work, the next step was superstition. Charms were common, very common. People placed objects near their bed to encourage sleep. Herbs like lavender, chamomile, and valerian were popular, not because medieval people understood chemistry, but because someone, somewhere, once said, "This worked for my cousin." They tucked herbs into pillows, hung them from bedposts, placed them under mattresses. Sometimes they used stones. Yes, literal rocks. Certain stones were believed to calm the mind. Others were said to ward off nightmares. Some were just rocks that looked reassuring. If you were rich enough, you might own a written charm, a small piece of parchment with a prayer or holy phrase written on it. You'd place it under your pillow. This worked because you believed it worked, which honestly is still how half of sleep advice functions today. Now, if herbs and charms failed, medieval people often turned to routine. Repetition was comforting. Predictable rituals soothed the mind. So you might recite the same prayer every night, in the same order, at the same pace. Monks were especially good at this, mostly because their entire lives were routines stacked on top of routines. In monasteries, insomnia was complicated. Monks already slept very little. They woke up multiple times a night for prayers called matins and lauds, sometimes at midnight, sometimes at 2 a.m., sometimes whenever the bell decided to ruin everyone's evening. So if a monk couldn't sleep, it wasn't immediately suspicious. But persistent sleeplessness, that raised eyebrows. because monks believed sleep was a gift from God, and lack of sleep might mean spiritual imbalance, or pride, or temptation, or the devil. The devil was blamed for insomnia surprisingly often, especially if the thoughts keeping you awake were inconveniently sinful. A monk lying awake thinking about food, or comfort, or, heaven forbid, another human being. That wasn't just insomnia, that was demonic interference. So monks fought sleeplessness with more prayer, more discipline, more self-denial. Sometimes they fasted, because clearly what your exhausted body needs is less food. And if that didn't work, they spoke to their abbot, who would gently advise them to pray harder, or think less, or accept that suffering builds character. Very helpful stuff. Now let's drift slowly toward the castles, because if you think peasants had it rough, wait until you see what medieval nobles did at night. Royal insomnia was its own special nightmare, mostly because rich people had too much time to think. Kings and queens slept on massive beds so large they sometimes required steps, with curtains drawn tightly around them. These curtains weren't for privacy, they were for warmth and to block drafts. But they also created a weird little fabric cave, perfect for staring into darkness and spiraling emotionally. Royal bedrooms were not quiet places. Servants slept nearby. Guards stood watch. Candles flickered. Wood cracked as it cooled. And if you were a king lying awake at night, you weren't thinking about laundry or livestock. You were thinking about betrayal, about heirs, about wars, about whether your cousin was secretly plotting something, which statistically he probably was. Royal insomnia often led to late-night religious devotion. Kings prayed, queens prayed, sometimes together, sometimes alone. Some royals kept priests on standby, just in case they needed spiritual reassurance at 3 a.m. Imagine waking a priest in the middle of the night to say, "Hey, I can't sleep. Am I damned?" And the priest, half awake, going, "No, your majesty, probably not. Try counting blessings." Of course, royals also used medicine. Medieval medicine, to be clear, was optimistic. Doctors prescribed sleep-inducing drinks, often wine-based, sometimes mixed with herbs, occasionally mixed with things that absolutely should not be consumed. Poppy was a favourite. Yes, that poppy. Opium-derived substances were known, used carefully, or not carefully at all. Dosages were vague, side effects were misunderstood, and addiction was not a concept anyone was prepared to discuss. But if it knocked you out, it was considered a success. Queens were especially prone to insomnia, partly because pregnancy was constant, and partly because royal women lived under intense scrutiny. They were expected to produce heirs, behave perfectly, remain pious, and not complain. So when queens couldn't sleep, they often turned inward. Private prayers, personal journals, confession. Some were given devotional books specifically for nighttime reading. Books designed to calm the soul, which is very sweet. Until you remember, most of those books were about death. Meditating on mortality was considered soothing. Nothing says sleep tight like contemplating the inevitability of your own decay. And if all else failed, people simply stayed awake. They accepted it. They sat by the fire. They watched candles burn down. They listened to the night. This is something modern life has almost erased. The idea that wakefulness doesn't always need fixing. For medieval people, night was long, very long, and sometimes you were just awake in it. They didn't panic. They didn't track sleep cycles. They didn't catastrophize about productivity tomorrow. They existed, quietly, patiently, which is oddly comforting. So as we drift deeper into this medieval night, remember that sleeplessness isn't new. It isn't broken. It isn't a failure. It's just humans, lying in the dark, thinking too much. In the next part, we'll wander into darker territory, nightmares, night demons, and the terrifying belief that something might be sitting on your chest while you sleep. But don't worry, we'll keep it calm and slow, and just unsettling enough to be interesting. For now, stay still, breathe slow, the candle is still burning. Alright, let's gently keep going. The candle hasn't gone out yet, the room is quiet, and medieval people unfortunately are still very awake. Now, once you've been lying there long enough, staring at the dark, listening to the wind slide through wooden beams, your thoughts start to drift, not in a poetic way, in a why am I thinking about this right now way. Medieval people were extremely familiar with night thoughts. They didn't call it anxiety, they called it temptation, or despair, or spiritual weakness. Nighttime was dangerous for the mind. During the day you worked, you sweated, you complained about taxes, you were too busy to think deeply, but at night, your body stopped, your mind did not. And medieval theology was very clear on this. An idle mind was a playground for bad influences, especially after midnight. There was a widespread belief that demons were more active at night. Not dramatically active, not Hollywood active, quietly active, whispering thoughts, planting doubts, encouraging memories you'd rather not revisit. So if you were awake, replaying embarrassing moments or sinful thoughts, that wasn't just normal human behaviour. That was something external, something watching. This is where medieval insomnia slides gently into medieval night fear. Let's talk about night terrors, not the modern medical kind, but the medieval interpretation. Many people reported the sensation of waking up unable to move, unable to breathe properly, with a crushing weight on their chest. Today, we call this sleep paralysis. Medieval people had other ideas. They believed a creature was sitting on them. In England, it was called the night hag. In Scandinavia, the mare. Yes, that's where the word nightmare comes from. It wasn't a dream, it was an entity, a small, malicious being that crept into your room at night, climbed onto your chest and slowly pressed the air out of you. Very relaxing bedtime lore. People describe seeing shapes in the dark, feeling breath on their face, hearing whispers, and because medieval rooms were genuinely dark, no streetlights, no LEDs, no glowing alarm clocks, the imagination had free rein. If this happened to you, the response wasn't therapy, it was protection. People slept with knives nearby, not for burglars, for demons. They hung crosses above beds, placed holy water nearby, carved symbols into bedposts. Some even slept with one eye open, which sounds impressive, and also extremely ineffective. If night terrors kept happening, people sought spiritual help. Priests were called, blessings were performed, rooms were cleansed. Sometimes the solution was as simple as rearranging the furniture, because maybe the demon preferred that corner. Again, this wasn't hysteria. This was their framework for understanding the unknown, and honestly, when you're awake at 3 a.m. and your brain invents problems that don't exist, the medieval explanation doesn't feel that far off. Now let's drift into a quieter space. Medieval reading. Yes, people read at night, sort of. Books were expensive, extremely expensive. Most people did not own them, and if they did, it was probably one book, written by hand, with personality. So nighttime reading wasn't casual scrolling, it was an event. Religious texts were the most common. Psalms, prayer books, lives of saints. Saints, by the way, were deeply unhelpful for insomnia. Many saints bragged about how little they slept. Some barely slept at all. They stayed awake praying, or standing, or sleeping on rocks. So if you were lying awake at night reading about someone who chose not to sleep, you weren't inspired. You were just tired and guilty. Still, reading was considered calming, especially repetitive texts. The rhythm mattered more than the meaning. Reading aloud quietly was common. The sound of your own voice soothed the mind. And if you couldn't read, someone else read to you? Yes, bedtime reading existed. It just wasn't whimsical. It was usually about martyrdom, which, again, medieval people found oddly comforting. Let's float now to a very specific group, medieval children. Because yes, children also struggled to sleep. A medieval childhood was brief. Kids slept with parents, with siblings, with extended family. Beds were shared. Privacy was non-existent. If a child couldn't sleep, it was often blamed on spirits, or fairies, or a general misalignment of the universe. Lullabies existed, and many were terrifying. Some warned children that monsters would take them if they didn't sleep. Others described death in soothing tones, nothing like being softly reminded of mortality to drift off. Parents also used amulets, small charms sewn into clothing, crosses tied near cradles. Rocking was common. Repetitive motion calmed both child and parent, and if nothing worked, the child stayed awake. There was no strict bedtime enforcement, no clock watching. Night was flexible. Which brings us to something important. Medieval people did not fear being tired tomorrow. They didn't structure life around peak productivity. They didn't obsess over energy levels. Work was physical, rhythmic, seasonal. If you were tired, you worked slower. That was it. So staying awake at night didn't come with the same pressure it does now. It wasn't a crisis. It was an inconvenience. Now, let's talk about late-night conversations, because one of the most common things medieval people did when they couldn't sleep was talk. Quietly, softly, in the dark. Spouses talked, family members talked, travellers in inns talked, nighttime loosened tongues. People confessed fears, shared regrets, discussed dreams. Some of these conversations were tender, others were deeply awkward. Imagine whispering to your spouse at midnight about your fear of dying without confession. Very romantic. In inns, strangers talked about roads, about rumours, about politics, which is how misinformation spread at night. Gently, half asleep. Some medieval laws even acknowledged nighttime talking, because people said things at night they might not say during the day. Night was honest, too honest. And sometimes sleeplessness led to creativity. Poems were written, songs composed, stories imagined. Many medieval texts mention being inspired during the night watch. Quiet encourages thought. Which brings us slowly to the idea that medieval people didn't always try to fix insomnia. Sometimes they used it. They accepted wakefulness as a different state of being, a thin space between sleep and day, a time for reflection, for prayer, for listening. And that acceptance might be the strangest part of all, because today we treat insomnia like a malfunction. Medieval people treated it like a message, sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil, sometimes from your own conscience, but always meaningful. In the next part, we'll drift toward the medical side, bloodletting, diets, bizarre advice, and the truly questionable things medieval doctors recommended to help people sleep. Spoiler, some of it made things much worse. For now, stay where you are, the night is still long. All right, the night rolls on. The fire has burned down to embers. The house has gone quiet in that deep, hollow way that only happens after midnight, and somewhere nearby, a medieval doctor is confidently making everything worse, because when medieval people couldn't sleep and prayer, charms, and quiet acceptance failed, they turned to medicine. Now, medieval medicine was built on a very delicate foundation. That foundation was called humours, 4 of them: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Your health depended entirely on these being in perfect balance. Sleep especially was deeply connected to them. Too much blood, you were restless. Too much phlegm, you were sluggish. Too much black bile, congratulations, you were melancholic and awake at night thinking about death, which, to be fair, was accurate. Doctors believed insomnia came from overheating of the brain. Yes, the brain was too hot. This was not metaphorical. They meant literal heat. So naturally the solution was to cool it down. This led to a range of treatments that were imaginative. One popular recommendation was diet control. Heavy foods were forbidden at night. Meat, cheese, fatty dishes, because digestion was thought to generate heat, and heat kept the brain awake. So if you couldn't sleep, the doctor would gently suggest you stop eating rich foods, which was great advice, unless you were already malnourished. Spicy food was also blamed, as was wine, except wine was also prescribed as a sleep aid. So, it depended on the doctor, and the day, and the vibes. Some doctors advised drinking warm milk, which is surprisingly modern. Others suggested watered-down wine with herbs. The herbs changed constantly. Poppy, henbane, mandrake. Mandrake, by the way, was mildly hallucinogenic and extremely poisonous. So if your sleep medicine caused vivid visions, nausea, or existential dread, that was considered a side effect, not a deal-breaker. Another popular treatment was bathing. Warm baths before bed were recommended, especially with scented oils. This was luxurious and mostly reserved for the wealthy. Poor people bathed when they could, which was occasionally. Still, the idea was sound. Warmth relaxes muscles, calms the body. Unfortunately, medieval plumbing did not exist, so baths were rare events, not nightly rituals. Now let's talk about the most infamous medieval medical solution to insomnia: bloodletting, of course. Because if your brain is too hot, the obvious answer is to remove blood. Doctors believed excess blood caused restlessness, especially in young men, so if you couldn't sleep, a physician might recommend opening a vein, usually in the arm, sometimes in the foot, because the foot was apparently connected to sleep, somehow. The logic was simple: less blood, less heat, more sleep. The results were mixed. Some people did fall asleep afterward, mostly because they were weak. Others felt worse, dizzy, cold, still awake. But bloodletting remained popular for centuries, because once a medical idea takes hold, it refuses to leave. Doctors also prescribed sleep posture. Yes, how you slept mattered. Sleeping on your right side was considered best. It aided digestion, calmed the heart, encouraged proper humoral flow. Sleeping on your back was dangerous. It could invite demons, or suffocation, or bad dreams. Sleeping on your stomach? Absolutely not. Doctors had opinions. They also had opinions about bedroom conditions. The room should be cool but not cold, quiet but not silent, dark but not pitch black. Candles were allowed. Too much darkness could invite bad thoughts, which is a fascinating contradiction, because candles also cast shadows, and shadows are not soothing. Doctors advised airing out rooms before bed. Fresh air was healthy. This was tricky in winter, but the advice stood. And then there were the truly strange recommendations. Some doctors suggested placing slices of lettuce on the head. Lettuce was cooling. Others advised wearing certain stones around the neck, or sleeping with a mirror nearby. Why a mirror? Unclear. But mirrors were thought to repel harmful influences, which, if nothing else, gave you something unsettling to stare at while awake. Now let's float gently into a very specific place, the medieval hospital. Hospitals were not places of healing as we understand them. They were places of care, often run by religious orders, focused on comfort rather than cure. Patients slept in large communal rooms, beds lined up, curtains for minimal privacy. Noise was constant. Coughing, moaning, praying. Insomnia was common, and it was treated with patience. Nuns and monks sat with patients at night. They talked quietly. They prayed. They didn't rush sleep. They waited for it. Which, oddly, might have been the best treatment available. Now let's drift back into the world of the elite, because medieval nobles had access to all of this bad advice, and then some. Royal physicians were highly educated, which mostly meant they were confident. They analysed kings' urine, their pulse, their dreams. Dreams mattered. If a king dreamed vividly, it meant imbalance. If he didn't dream, also imbalance. There was no winning. Some physicians recommended listening to music before bed. Soft instruments, lutes, harp. Yes, medieval ASMR existed. Queens were often lulled to sleep by music, or poetry. This was considered refined and effective. Sometimes servants read aloud until the royal fell asleep, which sounds relaxing, till you remember the servant had to stay awake the entire time. Insomnia also affected medieval scholars. These were people whose jobs involved thinking, and thinking is terrible for sleep. Scholars complained about racing thoughts, about ideas arriving at night, about being unable to turn their minds off. They wrote about it. One scholar described lying awake, replaying arguments, constructing essays in his head, which is extremely relatable. Their solution: writing. They got up, lit a candle, wrote until tired. This was dangerous. Candles caused fires, but creativity outweighed caution, and sometimes insomnia led to innovation. Which brings us to a gentle realization. Medieval people didn't just suffer through sleepless nights. They lived in them. They filled them with prayer, with thought, with conversation, with music, with terrible medical experiments. Sleep was important, but wakefulness wasn't shameful. It was part of the rhythm. In the next part, we'll drift toward belief, omens, astrology, lunar cycles, and the idea that sometimes you couldn't sleep because the universe said no. For now, let the night continue. Medieval people didn't just think insomnia came from the body or the soul. They were absolutely convinced the entire universe had opinions about their sleep schedule. And sometimes, according to them, the universe simply decided that tonight was not a sleeping night. No appeal process, no explanation, just vibes. Astrology was everywhere in medieval life. Not the fun personality test astrology, the serious destiny-controlling kind. Kings consulted astrologers before wars. Farmers consulted the stars before planting crops. Doctors consulted planetary charts before prescribing medicine. And yes, sleep was also governed by the heavens. Of course it was. If you couldn't sleep, a medieval thinker might calmly explain that Mars was dominant, or Saturn was looming, or the moon was in the wrong phase, or some combination of all three, stacked on top of your already flawed personality. Saturn especially had a terrible reputation. Saturn was cold, slow, heavy, and deeply associated with melancholy. If Saturn was strong in the sky, sleeplessness was practically expected. You weren't broken. You were just under Saturn's influence, which was medieval shorthand for everything feels bad and it's not your fault, but also there's nothing you can do about it. The moon mattered too. Full moons were blamed for restlessness, vivid dreams, emotional instability, and strange nighttime behaviour, which again is oddly familiar. Medieval people believed the moon pulled on the fluids in the body the same way it pulled the tides. Too much lunar influence meant too much movement inside you. Your blood stirred. Your thoughts wandered. Sleep slipped away. So if you were awake on a bright moonlit night, staring at the ceiling, listening to dogs bark in the distance, you weren't unlucky. You were lunar. This cosmic explanation was comforting in its own way. It meant insomnia wasn't a personal failure. You hadn't sinned too much. You hadn't failed to pray hard enough. The sky simply wasn't aligned for rest. So you waited it out. You accepted it. You lived in the night. And medieval nights were long, unbelievably long. Without electric light, darkness arrived early and stayed late. Winter nights stretched endlessly. People spent hours awake in dim, amber-lit rooms where time felt thick and slow. Clocks were rare. Minutes didn't matter. Hours blurred together. You didn't know if it was midnight or nearly dawn. You only knew you were still awake, and the world outside was quiet. That quiet mattered. Medieval silence wasn't total silence. It was layered. Wind against walls, animals shifting, distant footsteps, church bells far away. And in that quiet, the mind filled the space. People remembered things they'd said years ago. They worried about debts. They imagined future disasters. They replayed conversations. They thought about death. A lot. Medieval culture was deeply comfortable with death as a concept. It was everywhere. But nighttime made it personal. Lying awake, staring into the dark, people imagined their final moments. Had they confessed properly? Would they be forgiven? Would they wake up tomorrow at all? These thoughts weren't considered morbid. They were considered responsible. Night was a time for moral inventory. Sleep or no sleep, the night demanded reflection. This is why so many medieval prayers were designed specifically for nighttime. Short prayers you could repeat endlessly. Prayers to say before sleep. Prayers to say if you woke suddenly. Prayers to say if you feared dying before morning. They weren't dramatic. They were steady, familiar, repetitive. The repetition mattered more than the words. It gave the mind something to rest on, even if sleep itself didn't come. Some people whispered prayers until their voices went hoarse. Others counted them silently, like beads moving through the fingers of the mind. This was medieval meditation, though they wouldn't have called it that. It wasn't about clearing the mind, it was about anchoring it. And when even prayer failed, people watched the night move. They observed shadow shifting, candle flames bending. The slow, almost imperceptible change in darkness as night crept toward morning. There was no pressure to force sleep, no concept of, I need to be functional tomorrow. Tomorrow would arrive whether you slept or not. Work would happen whether you were rested or not. So you waited. In households with multiple people awake, insomnia became communal. Someone would cough. Someone would whisper. Someone would get up to adjust the fire. Night wasn't isolating in the way it often is now. You were rarely alone. Even if you didn't speak, you sensed others nearby, breathing, shifting, existing in the same sleepless state. That shared wakefulness mattered. It softened the experience. In towns and cities, night watchmen walked the streets. Their calls echoed through the darkness, marking time. "All is well," they'd shout, or sometimes the hour. Those voices reassured people lying awake in bed. The world hadn't ended. Someone was awake with you. Someone was guarding the night. Insomnia also had a moral dimension for the wealthy that it didn't have for the poor. A peasant awake at night might shrug it off. A noble awake at night worried it meant something. Divine displeasure? A warning? An omen? Especially if sleeplessness came suddenly or persisted without explanation. Chronic insomnia in a ruler was unsettling. It suggested imbalance, weakness, a crack in the divine order that placed them on the throne in the first place. Some kings became obsessed with their sleep, tracking it obsessively, centuries before anyone wore a ring that told them they slept poorly. They asked servants if they tossed and turned. They demanded adjustments to bedding, lighting, temperature. They cycled through physicians. They prayed more. They fasted more. They drank more remedies, all in pursuit of rest that refused to arrive. Queens, meanwhile, endured sleeplessness quietly, especially during pregnancy, which was constant and dangerous. Nighttime brought discomfort, fear, and the ever-present awareness that childbirth could kill them. They lay awake feeling movement, listening to their own breath, wondering if this child would live, if they would live, and if the kingdom depended on it. Sleep, when it came, was shallow. Children, too, absorbed the nighttime anxiety of adults. They learned early that night was a different world. Stories told after dark were darker, warnings were sharper, Shadows meant more. Sleepless children weren't entertained. They were calmed, hushed, prayed over, or simply allowed to stay awake. Childhood insomnia wasn't pathologized. It was managed with closeness, touch, presence. And then there were the old. The elderly often slept poorly. This was expected. Nighttime wakefulness was considered part of approaching death. Older people sat awake longer, prayed more, spoke more about the past. They passed time by telling stories to anyone else awake. Insomnia became a space for memory, for quiet legacy building, for recounting events that younger listeners would half remember and half forget. As dawn approached, the quality of wakefulness changed. The darkest part of the night wasn't always the hardest. That was earlier, closer to midnight. The hours before dawn carried relief. Birds stirred, the air shifted. Light crept back into the world slowly, almost politely. People who had been awake all night didn't feel defeated. They felt finished. The night had done what it was going to do. Some slept briefly just before sunrise. Others stayed awake and transitioned directly into morning. There was no sharp boundary, just flow. This is perhaps the most striking difference between medieval insomnia and modern insomnia. Today, wakefulness feels like an enemy, a malfunction, a problem to be solved aggressively. In the medieval world, wakefulness was an alternate mode of being. Not ideal, not desirable, but not catastrophic. They didn't chase sleep. They waited for it. And maybe that's why so many medieval texts speak of the night with a strange tenderness. Fear, yes. Anxiety, yes. But also familiarity. Night was a place you visited often. Sometimes unwillingly. Sometimes reluctantly. But you learned its rhythms. You learned how to sit in it. So if you're listening to this while awake, while the world is quiet and your thoughts are louder than you'd like, you're not doing anything new. You're participating in something ancient, something deeply human, something that predates clocks and screens and productivity metrics. You're just awake, and the night is letting you be. In the next part, we'll drift toward the end of the night, toward dawn, early risers, monks greeting the morning half asleep, and the strange medieval acceptance that sometimes you simply didn't sleep, and life went on anyway. For now, don't rush. The stars are still there, and the night hasn't finished with you yet. Tonight, we're talking about something that history books usually rush past very quickly, because it's awkward, depressing, and doesn't make anyone look particularly heroic. What really happened to royal women after a dynasty fell? Not the dramatic battlefield stuff. Not the speeches. Not the flags coming down in slow motion. We're talking about the aftermath, the quiet years, the exile houses, the convents, the forgotten apartments, the pensions that never arrived, the women who woke up one morning as queens and went to bed that night as a political inconvenience. So settle in, breathe slow, and let's begin. Royal history loves a clean ending. A king loses a war, signs a treaty, hands over a crown, and cut, scene over, onto the next dynasty. But that's not how it worked for the women, because women didn't just lose power, they lost security, identity, income, status, and sometimes even their names. A fallen king might die gloriously, or dramatically, or at least memorably. A fallen queen usually just lingered. Let's start with a very common scenario, one that played out over and over again across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. A dynasty collapses. There's a rebellion, a foreign invasion, or a neat little coup that everyone insists was necessary. The king is deposed, imprisoned, executed, or politely escorted into exile. And the royal women, wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, are suddenly classified as a problem, not an enemy, not a hero, just a loose end. Because royal women carried legitimacy. They carried bloodlines. They carried inconvenient wombs that could produce claimants, which meant they couldn't just be left alone, but also couldn't be celebrated, so they were managed. Let's float gently into medieval Europe, because honestly, they perfected this particular form of quiet cruelty. Imagine you're a queen consort in the 1300s. You married at 14 because of course you did. You were shipped across borders like a decorative treaty clause. You learned a new language, a new court etiquette, and the exact number of steps behind your husband you were allowed to walk. You did everything right. You produced heirs. You hosted banquets. You nodded thoughtfully while men argued loudly around you. And then your husband loses. Maybe he loses a war. Maybe he loses a civil conflict. Maybe he just loses popularity, which in medieval politics was often fatal. Suddenly, you're no longer Her Majesty. You're the former Queen, which is not a job title anyone respected. Most deposed queens were given 3 options. None of them were great. Option 1, exile. Option 2, a convent. Option 3, house arrest with a very polite guard. Exile sounds romantic until you realise exile meant living off whatever jewellery you managed to smuggle out before the gates closed. It meant relying on relatives who were suddenly very busy and very unavailable. It meant being constantly watched, because you might still be useful as a bargaining chip. And convents. Ah, yes. The medieval answer to we don't know what to do with her. Convents were not peaceful retreats full of chanting and gardens. They were political storage units. You didn't join a convent because you felt spiritually called. You joined because your existence was inconvenient. Once inside, you were safe, but also erased. You couldn't marry. You couldn't claim anything. You couldn't pass on a bloodline. Problem solved. And if you think that was rare, it absolutely was not. Europe quietly filled its convents with former queens, princesses and noblewomen whose families had backed the wrong side. Some adapted. Some found comfort in routine. Some became powerful abbesses, which was one of the very few ways women could still wield influence. But many didn't. Many spent decades reliving a life that no longer existed. Now let's talk about royal daughters, because they had it even worse. A princess after a fallen dynasty was dangerous. She had a claim. She had symbolic value. She had marriage potential, which meant she was either married off immediately to neutralize her claim, or kept unmarried on purpose. Yes, on purpose. An unmarried princess could not produce heirs, but she could still be paraded around as a symbol, so she was kept close, watched, controlled, often dressed plainly, often denied education, often denied even the courtesy of being addressed by her former title. History likes to pretend these women disappeared quietly, but many of them wrote letters, petitions, complaints, letters that went unanswered. Let's drift now to England, because England was particularly talented at humiliating its former queens. Take the case of queens consort whose husbands were deposed or executed. These women were rarely punished directly. Instead, they were reduced. Their households were cut. Their allowances shrank. Their jewels were reclaimed by the crown, which was a fun way of saying confiscated. Some queens were allowed to keep 1 or 2 ladies in waiting. Others were left with servants who had once bowed deeply and now barely acknowledged them. One day you preside over a court. The next day you're arguing with a steward over whether you're allowed extra firewood. Many former queens were forced to move constantly, from manor to manor, never allowed to settle, and loyalty was dangerous. Now let's float across the Channel for a moment and look at France, where fallen dynasties produced an entire genre of forgotten women. French royal women were often placed in luxurious-looking exile, a chateau, a countryside estate. From the outside, it looked comfortable. From the inside, it was a velvet-lined cage. Visitors were controlled. Letters were read. Movements were monitored. You were allowed to exist, just not to matter. And the cruelest part was memory. Royal women were expected to remember who they had been, without reminding anyone else. They were supposed to be grateful, quiet, invisible. Let's gently shift eastward now, because this pattern was not uniquely European. In imperial China, when a dynasty fell, the women of the imperial household entered a bureaucratic nightmare. They had no family alliances strong enough to protect them, no marriage contracts, no children with recognized claims. Many were forced into labor, some were sold, some were quietly killed, depending on how paranoid the new regime felt. But even those who survived lived in a strange limbo. They had once been dressed in silk, trained to perform grace, and surrounded by servants. Now they were anonymous women in a society that valued lineage above all else, and lineage, unfortunately, had just collapsed. Back to Europe for a moment, because we need to talk about widows. Royal widows, after a fallen dynasty, were particularly tragic figures. A royal widow was dangerous because she had experience. She knew court politics, she knew secrets, and she had survived. So what did they do with her? They aged her, not physically, socially. She was referred to as the dowager, even if she was 30. She was dressed conservatively. She was encouraged to retreat from public life. Her opinions became emotional. Her memories became nostalgic. Her presence became unnecessary. Many widowed queens spent decades managing dwindling estates, writing letters to sons who could not acknowledge them, and negotiating with governments that preferred to forget they existed. And then there were the queens who refused to disappear. These women were labelled difficult, ambitious, unstable. History often paints them as villains. But when you read their letters, their petitions, their surviving words, a different picture emerges. They were women fighting erasure. They demanded pensions that had been promised. They demanded recognition of their children's rights. They demanded the dignity of being addressed by their proper titles. And for that, they were punished quietly. House arrest tightened, allowances were delayed, supporters were dismissed. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just slow pressure. Now let's talk about the emotional toll, because this is where things get very human. Royal women were raised to believe their value was absolute, divinely ordained, inseparable from the crown. And then that crown vanished. Former queens reported depression, anxiety, insomnia. Some refused to leave their chambers. Some obsessed over etiquette long after it no longer mattered. They corrected servants who no longer served them. They insisted on ceremonies no one attended. This wasn't arrogance. It was grief. They were mourning a self that no longer existed. And there was no framework for that grief. No therapy. No acknowledgement. Just silence. Let's drift now into a slightly later period, because dynastic collapse didn't end with the Middle Ages. Early modern Europe continued the tradition, just with better furniture. Queens after failed revolutions or overthrown monarchies were often sent abroad. They became permanent guests, living in borrowed palaces, dependent on foreign pensions that could disappear at any time. They hosted salons they could barely afford. They wore outdated fashion. They spoke nostalgically about courts that no longer existed. And slowly, they faded. Their children often married into lesser nobility. Their grandchildren grew up hearing stories that sounded increasingly unbelievable. "We used to be royalty," they'd say, and no one quite knew what to do with that information. So stay comfortable, let your breathing slow, and when you're ready, we'll continue. All right, if you're still awake, that's fine. If you drifted off somewhere around the convents and pensions, welcome back. Let's just ease ourselves back into it. No sudden movements. When a dynasty fell, the worst fate for a royal woman was not death. Death was clean. Death was final. Death came with ceremonies and prayers and occasionally sympathy. The real punishment was survival. Because surviving meant waking up every day in a world that no longer needed you, but also refused to fully let you go. Many royal women outlived their dynasties by decades, and history rarely knows what to do with those decades, so it usually compresses them into a single sentence like, "She lived quietly in exile," which is historian code for, "We stopped paying attention." Let's talk about what living quietly actually meant. It meant waking up in a residence that technically belonged to someone else. It meant eating meals paid for by a government that resented you. It meant measuring every word because a single careless comment could be reported, exaggerated, and used as justification to tighten your restrictions. Former queens learned very quickly that silence was safer than honesty. They smiled when visitors arrived. They praised the new regime in carefully neutral language. They pretended gratitude while privately counting coins, and money mattered more than you might think. Royal women were accustomed to wealth that was not abstract. It was daily. It was assumed. It was invisible. After a dynasty fell, money became a constant anxiety. Pensions were promised and delayed. Allowances were reduced temporarily and never restored. Jewellery was sold piece by piece, often to the very nobles who had once bowed to them. Some women clung fiercely to a single crown jewel, ring or necklace, not because of its value, but because it proved that their former life had been real. There are heartbreaking records of former queens arguing with officials over firewood, candles, or repairs to leaking roofs. Women who had once approved national budgets now begging for basic maintenance. And if that sounds humiliating, that's because it was designed to be. Humiliation was policy. Let's float over to the issue of names, because losing your name was one of the strangest parts of dynastic collapse. Royal women were known by titles, not personal identities. Queen of this, Duchess of that, Princess of somewhere else. When the dynasty fell, those titles were suddenly controversial. New regimes often refused to use them. They referred to former queens by their maiden names, or worse, by nothing at all, just the lady. Imagine being addressed like that after a lifetime of ceremony. It was a psychological stripping, done politely. Some women resisted fiercely. They signed letters with their full titles long after they were officially meaningless. They corrected people who addressed them incorrectly, and historians often mock this behaviour as delusional. But it wasn't delusion, it was resistance. If you lose your name, you lose your narrative. Now let's talk about motherhood, because this is where things become especially grim. Royal mothers after a fallen dynasty lived in constant fear for their children. Sons were threats, daughters were assets, and neither belonged fully to their mothers anymore. Many sons were taken away for their own safety, placed in monasteries, sent abroad, educated under watchful eyes that reported every opinion. Mothers wrote letters that went unanswered, or were intercepted, or were returned unopened. Some women spent the rest of their lives never seeing their sons again. Daughters, meanwhile, were bargaining chips. A fallen dynasty's daughter could be married strategically to neutralize claims, or kept unmarried to prevent heirs. Mothers had no say in these decisions. And imagine how powerless that felt. You were raised to believe your primary purpose was producing heirs. Then once you did, you were removed from their lives. Some mothers became obsessed with genealogy. They memorized bloodlines, claims, and alliances long after those things had lost practical meaning. It was a way to stay connected, to feel relevant. Now let's gently drift toward one of the quietest tragedies of all. Royal women who aged out of usefulness. Youth gave royal women value. marriageability, fertility, symbolism. Age gave them nothing. Once a former queen or princess past childbearing age, political interest in her dropped sharply. She was no longer a threat, no longer an asset, just there. And this is where history truly forgets them. Older royal women often lived in near isolation. Their courts reduced to a handful of loyal servants, their days structured by routine and memory. They prayed, they embroidered, they reread old letters, and they waited. For what? It's not entirely clear. Some waited for restoration, some waited for recognition, some waited for death. The answer was almost always no. They reminded people of instability, of previous regimes, of inconvenient history. Better to keep them out of sight. Let's slide now into a slightly different category. Royal women who tried to reinvent themselves. These women are rare but fascinating. A few former queens attempted to redefine their identity outside the crown. They patronised artists. They funded religious institutions. They became correspondents with philosophers, and occasionally it worked. But even success was limited. Their projects were constantly framed as nostalgia, their opinions dismissed as remnants of a bygone era. They could act, but never fully belong. Now let's talk about blame, because blame clung to royal women long after dynasties fell. If a king failed, historians debated strategy. If a queen was involved, they questioned morality. Was she too ambitious, too foreign, too emotional? Foreign-born queens were especially vulnerable. After a dynasty collapsed, xenophobia flourished. Former queens were blamed for corruption, decadence, and decline. She was never truly one of us, people said, as if that explained everything. These women carried the burden of national disappointment on their shoulders, and because they were women, they couldn't publicly defend themselves. Their voices survive mostly in private letters, diaries, marginal notes, quiet protests written in ink. Now let's drift across time and geography again, because this pattern repeats with astonishing consistency. In the Islamic world, royal women after a fallen dynasty were often confined within extended family networks. They weren't publicly humiliated, they weren't executed, but they were absorbed. Their identities dissolved into households. They became someone's aunt, someone's widow, someone's dependent, and while this could offer physical safety, it erased public presence. Royal women who had once sponsored poets, scholars, and architects now lived in domestic obscurity. Their names faded quickly from official records, and again, historians often describe this as retirement, which is a generous interpretation. Now let's return to Europe one more time, because we need to talk about the peculiar cruelty of conditional forgiveness. Some fallen dynasties were forgiven, sort of. Royal women were allowed to stay, under conditions. They had to renounce claims, publicly, repeatedly. They had to attend ceremonies that celebrated the very regime that displaced them. They had to smile and bow. This was not reconciliation, it was performance, and failure to perform had consequences. Privileges revoked, residences reassigned, visitors restricted, compliance was rewarded with survival, resistance was punished with isolation. Now, something that doesn't get talked about enough is how these women processed time. Royal life was intensely structured, ceremonial calendars, religious festivals, court events. After a dynasty fell, time became shapeless. Days blended together, years passed quietly. Former queens often clung to anniversaries, coronation dates, birthdays, deaths. They marked time privately, even when no one else remembered. And this created a strange dissonance. The world moved on, they did not. Some women became fixated on the past, others avoided it entirely. Both responses were coping mechanisms, and then there were the women who hoped, against all logic. They believed restoration was just around the corner, that supporters were organising, that foreign powers would intervene. Sometimes this hope was encouraged by outsiders who wanted leverage. False promises were made, letters were written, plans were discussed, and then nothing. Hope for these women was often the cruelest thing of all. Now let's slow down a little here, because what we're really talking about is grief, prolonged grief, not just for lost power, but for lost selves. Royal women were not raised to imagine alternative futures. There was no plan B. So when plan A collapsed, they drifted and drifted and drifted. Some became deeply religious, others deeply cynical. Some maintained impeccable dignity until death. Others quietly unravelled. But almost all of them were lonely. Lonely in rooms that were too large. Lonely in memories no one shared. Lonely in histories that would eventually reduce them to footnotes. And speaking of footnotes, let's acknowledge how many of these women remain unnamed. History remembers dynasties. It remembers kings. It forgets the women who lived through the aftermath, the wives who negotiated survival, the mothers who protected children as best they could, the daughters who grew old waiting for lives that never arrived. These women didn't fall dramatically. They faded, and fading is harder to write about, harder to dramatize, harder to remember, which is why we're lingering here. So stay comfortable. Let your breathing slow again, and when you're ready, we'll continue. Part 3. The women who couldn't leave, even when they were free to go all right. Let's keep drifting. No sharp turns, no big drama. Just a slow continuation, like a long hallway with soft carpets and portraits that no one remembers anymore. One of the strangest things about fallen dynasties is that, occasionally, royal women were technically free. Free to leave, free to travel, free to reinvent themselves. And yet, many didn't. Not because they were imprisoned, but because freedom for someone raised inside a court was terrifying. Royal women were trained for a very specific environment. Hierarchy, ritual, predictability. Every movement had meaning. Every word had weight. Every mistake had consequences. Outside of that world, things were vague. And vagueness is deeply unsettling when you've been raised on rules. So many former queens and princesses stayed exactly where they were placed after a dynasty fell. Same residence, same routines, same carefully limited social circles. They knew how to survive there. They didn't know how to exist anywhere else. Let's talk about one of the most quietly tragic archetypes in royal history, the woman who refused to adapt. These women continued court life long after the court had vanished. They dressed formally every day. They insisted on full titles. They arranged seating according to rank, even if there were only 3 people in the room. Servants humoured them. Visitors felt uncomfortable. Officials rolled their eyes, and historians later on described them as eccentric. But again, this wasn't madness. It was structure. When everything meaningful in your life has been stripped away, structure becomes survival. Some women recreated entire court routines inside exile residences, morning prayers at the same hour, meals served with ceremony, audiences granted to no one in particular. They were performing memory, because memory at least was something no one could confiscate. Now let's ease into another uncomfortable reality. Some royal women benefited from dynastic collapse. Not many, but a few. These were women who had lived under suffocating court expectations, constant scrutiny, political marriages, relentless pressure to produce heirs. For them, exile was quieter. They could read, think, rest. Some even described feeling relief, and history does not know what to do with these women at all. Because they don't fit the tragedy narrative. They don't fit the villain narrative either. They were women who discovered, too late and at great cost, that they preferred obscurity to power. Of course, even this relief came with conditions. They still had limited income, limited freedom, limited futures. But the absence of constant surveillance felt like breathing after being underwater. Now let's drift gently toward women who did try to leave. Some former royal women attempted to start over in foreign courts. They learned new languages, adopted new customs, reframed their identities. This was especially common among younger princesses who had not yet been married. They became ladies-in-waiting, companions, educated nobles. But even here, the past followed them. They were always the former princess, never just a woman. Marriage prospects were complicated. Some men were drawn to the prestige, others feared the politics. A woman who had once been royalty was simultaneously valuable and dangerous. She might bring attention, she might bring claims, she might bring trouble. So many remained unmarried, not by choice, but by calculation, and loneliness settled in quietly. Now let's pause on a particularly cruel irony. Royal women were expected to embody stability, tradition, continuity. And yet, when dynasties fell, they were blamed for instability. If a kingdom collapsed, people asked what the queen had done wrong. Had she interfered too much? Not enough? Had she influenced her husband? Or failed to? There was no correct answer, and the blame stuck long after facts faded. Former queens were remembered as symbols of decline, of decadence, of moral failure, even when they had no actual power, and because history was written mostly by men aligned with the new regime. These narratives went unchallenged. Royal women knew this. They knew how they were being portrayed, and it haunted them. Some spent years attempting to correct the record, writing memoirs, commissioning sympathetic accounts, encouraging loyal chroniclers. Most of these efforts failed. Their writings were suppressed, ignored, or dismissed as biased, which of course they were, but so was everything else. Now let's float toward something quieter still. Death. When royal women who outlived their dynasties finally died, their deaths were often small. No state funerals, no national mourning, no official recognition. Sometimes the new regime allowed a modest ceremony, sometimes not. Graves were unmarked, burials were private. In some cases, former queens were buried under names that barely resembled their former titles. And with that, history moved on, or thought it did. But here's the thing. These women didn't disappear entirely. They survived in family stories, in whispered anecdotes, in forgotten letters tucked into archives. They survived in small acts of remembrance, a servant who kept a portrait, a local priest who noted their kindness, a grandchild who remembered stories of silk dresses and lost palaces. History didn't erase them completely. It just stopped listening. And that's what makes their story so unsettling. Because dynastic collapse wasn't a moment, it was a lifetime. For kings, it was often a final chapter. For royal women, it was the rest of the book. They woke up every day in the aftermath, adjusted, endured, and did so quietly. No dramatic speeches, no grand revenge arcs, just survival, which oddly enough might be the most human story of all. So let's slow down again. If you're drifting off, that's perfect. If you're still listening, that's fine too. In the next part, we'll move even closer to the emotional core, to letters, to private thoughts, to the inner lives of women history preferred to see as symbols, not people. So stay where you are, breathe slowly, and when you're ready, we'll continue. Part 4. Letters that were never meant to be read. If you want to understand what really happened to royal women after a dynasty fell, you don't look at treaties or chronicles, you look at letters. Letters were the one place these women could still speak honestly. Not publicly, not safely, but honestly. Most of these letters were never meant for history. They were meant for sisters, daughters, former ladies-in-waiting, or distant relatives who still remembered how things used to be. And they all sound strangely similar. They rarely talk about power. They rarely talk about politics. They talk about waiting for permission, waiting for money, waiting for news, waiting for someone, anyone, to remember that they were still alive. A former queen would write to a cousin and casually mention that her allowance had not arrived for 6 months. Not angrily, just factually, as if hunger were a scheduling issue. Another would write about the weather, about the cold, about damp walls, about servants leaving because they could no longer be paid. These letters are quiet, painfully polite, because even in exile, royal women were trained not to complain. One woman wrote, "I do not wish to be a burden." She had once been the centre of an entire court. Another wrote, "I remain where I am as instructed." She had been instructed to remain there for 17 years. And the saddest letters of all were written by women who still believed restoration was possible. They wrote about dreams, about signs, about rumours they had heard from passing visitors. "I am told there is sympathy," one wrote. "There is talk." There was always talk. There was never action. And gradually the tone of the letters changes. Hope thins out. Language softens. Requests become smaller. Instead of asking for restoration, they ask for repairs. Instead of asking for recognition, they ask for shoes. Instead of asking for justice, they ask for candles. And finally, they stop asking at all. One of the most striking things about these letters is how often they apologize. "I am sorry to trouble you. I hesitate to write. I fear I am asking too much." These women had been raised to command rooms. Now they apologize for existing. And yet even here, dignity lingers. They never fully surrender their sense of self. They never say they were wrong to be queens. They never renounce who they were. They just lower their expectations, which might be the quietest form of tragedy. Now let's drift away from letters and into memory, because memory was both refuge and torment. Former royal women lived inside their memories. They remembered coronations in exquisite detail, the weight of robes, the sound of trumpets, the smell of incense. They remembered who stood where, who smiled sincerely, who didn't. And memory became a double-edged thing. It kept them grounded. It also kept them trapped. Some women refused to speak of the past at all. They changed the subject. They discouraged questions. Others talked about it constantly. Visitors noticed this. They wrote about it later. "She spoke as if it were yesterday," one wrote. "It was difficult to listen." But imagine being the only living witness to your own former life. Of course you would talk about it. Now let's talk about loyalty, because loyalty after a fallen dynasty was a complicated thing. Some servants stayed, not because they were paid well. They weren't, but because they believed in the woman they served. These relationships became intense. Servants became companions, confidants, sometimes the only witnesses to grief. And this created a strange inversion. Royal women who had once been emotionally distant learned intimacy late in life. They learned to talk, to confide, to rely. But this intimacy was fragile. Servants died, moved away, were dismissed by officials who wanted to reduce influence, and each loss reopened the wound. Some former queens ended their lives surrounded by people who barely knew who they were. Now let's slide gently into another uncomfortable truth. Not all royal women were kind. Not all were sympathetic. Not all were victims in the way we'd like them to be. Some had been cruel, some arrogant, some deeply complicit in the systems that oppressed others, and exile did not magically redeem them. Some remained bitter, suspicious, demanding. They resented their circumstances. They resented the world. They resented anyone who adapted better than they did. And history tends to seize on these women. These are the women remembered as mad, difficult, unstable. But here's the thing. Bitterness makes sense when your entire identity collapses. So does anger. So does refusal. They weren't wrong to feel betrayed. They just had no socially acceptable way to express it. Now let's slow down and talk about silence. Silence was enforced externally, but it also became internal. Many royal women stopped writing altogether in their later years. Not because they had nothing to say, but because saying it hurt too much. They withdrew. They attended fewer events, received fewer visitors, spoke less. Officials noted this approvingly. "She causes no trouble," they wrote, as if trouble were the same as existence. And then there were the women who lived long enough to be forgotten by the regime that once feared them. This is one of the strangest outcomes of all. A former queen, once monitored closely, eventually becomes irrelevant. Guards are reassigned. Reports stop being written. She is still alive, but no longer important. And this could be oddly liberating. Some women use this invisibility to regain small freedoms: unmonitored walks, private reading, unsupervised correspondence. But invisibility also meant abandonment. If something went wrong, no one noticed. If she fell ill, help was slow. If she died, the news travelled quietly, which brings us to illness. Royal women after dynastic collapse often suffered prolonged illnesses, some physical, some psychological, often both. Doctors visited infrequently, treatments were outdated, pain was normalised, and illness reinforced dependence. A woman who might have left, stayed. A woman who might have resisted, endured. Bodies like dynasties declined slowly. Now let's talk about religion, because religion became one of the few sanctioned outlets for grief. Many former queens turned deeply religious, not performatively, desperately. Prayer gave structure, meaning, a sense that suffering was not random. Convents became both refuge and resignation. Some women genuinely found peace there. Others simply disappeared into routine. And again, historians simplify this. She retired to a convent, they say, as if retirement were the point. But convent life was rarely chosen freely. It was negotiated survival. Now let's pause. Because everything we've discussed so far shares one theme. Royal women did not end when dynasties fell. They continued. And continuation, without purpose, is exhausting. Which brings us gently into the final stretch. Part 5. When no one is watching anymore. By the time a former queen reached old age, she had outlived almost everyone who remembered her reign. Courtiers were dead, rivals gone, children grown or lost. She existed in a strange historical vacuum, too old to matter, too symbolic to fully ignore. And old age stripped away the last illusions. Restoration was no longer coming. Justice was no longer expected. Recognition was no longer desired. What remained was endurance, daily rituals, simple pleasures, small grievances. Food mattered, warmth mattered, conversation mattered. These women became intensely aware of the present moment, not because they had achieved enlightenment, but because the future had been taken away. Some developed dark humour. They joked about their former lives, about how ridiculous it all seemed now. Others clung stubbornly to dignity. They insisted on proper forms of address until the very end. They corrected priests at their deathbeds. This wasn't vanity. It was coherence. They needed their lives to make sense. And then, quietly, they died. No announcements, no grand funerals. Sometimes the burial was delayed because officials couldn't decide who should pay. Sometimes the grave was unmarked because no one knew what name to use. And that was that. History moved on. Again. But here's the thing. These women were not failures. They were witnesses. They witnessed the fragility of power, the emptiness of ceremony, the cruelty of political memory. They lived long enough to see that crowns were temporary, but consequences were not. And that might be the most unsettling lesson of all. Because history loves collapse, it loves endings, it loves clean transitions. But human lives are not clean. They spill, they linger, they fade slowly. Royal women after fallen dynasties did not vanish in flames or scandals. They sat in rooms, they wrote letters, they waited, and waiting became their legacy. So if you're drifting now, that's perfect. Because this story was never meant to keep you awake. It was meant to hum softly in the background. Like memory, like loss, like a life lived quietly after the world stopped watching. Breathe slowly. Let the details blur. And when sleep comes, let it come gently, just like history did not. Part 6. The afterlife of a former queen. There's a moment that comes for almost every royal woman who survives her dynasty. It's subtle. It doesn't arrive with ceremony. It's the moment when people stop asking her opinion. Not officially. No announcement is made. It just happens. A visitor comes and speaks politely, but doesn't wait for a response. An official delivers news instead of requesting advice. A decision is explained rather than discussed. And she realizes slowly that her voice has expired. This is often more painful than the loss of power itself, because power is abstract, voice is personal. Former queens noticed this shift immediately. They described it obliquely in letters. They informed me. They decided. They thought it best. The passive language is telling. She is still present, but no longer participating, and from that moment on, life changes texture. Days become quieter, longer, thinner. Royal women were raised in constant interaction. Audiences, petitions, conversations layered with meaning. When that vanished, silence expanded. Some women filled it with routine, some with prayer, some with obsessive attention to domestic detail. They reorganized cupboards, counted linens, tracked expenses down to the smallest coin. Control had shrunk, so they concentrated it, and this wasn't trivial. It was a way of asserting existence. Now let's talk about how former queens were treated by history while still alive. This is an odd category, but an important one. As new regimes settled in, they began to write histories of the fallen dynasty, and these histories often appeared while the women involved were still breathing. Imagine reading a version of your life that paints you as a footnote, or worse, a problem. Some women were portrayed as manipulative, others as naive, others as irrelevant, and they knew it. They heard about these accounts through visitors, through whispered remarks, through accidental insults. A former queen might be told, casually, that a pamphlet described her influence as minimal. Minimal! After decades of survival, childbirth, negotiation and endurance. And yet there was nothing she could do. Public rebuttal would be seen as proof of instability. Silence would be taken as admission. So she endured misrepresentation too. Now let's float gently into another reality. Boredom. This sounds trivial. It isn't. Royal women lived in environments saturated with stimulation, ceremony, music, conversation, intrigue. After dynastic collapse, boredom set in like fog. Days stretched, weeks blended, seasons passed almost unnoticed. Boredom became a kind of emotional erosion. Some women coped by reading obsessively, others by sewing elaborate projects that took years. Some memorized religious texts, others learned foreign languages they would never use, anything to mark time, because unmarked time is unbearable, and boredom fed introspection. Former queens thought a lot about mistakes, about choices they never made, about paths not taken. This kind of thinking is rarely kind. Now let's talk about resentment, because resentment was unavoidable. Royal women resented their husbands for failing, for dying, for trusting the wrong people. They resented advisors, allies, relatives who disappeared when things went wrong. They resented foreign courts that offered sympathy but no help. And sometimes They resented their own children, not because they didn't love them, but because children represented what might have been. A son who never reigned, a daughter who never married as planned. These thoughts were rarely spoken aloud, but they existed, and they complicated grief. Now let's drift into the issue of reputation after death, because for many royal women, death did not bring clarity, it brought simplification. Their lives were condensed into a sentence, sometimes less. She lived quietly in exile. She died unmarried. She retired to a convent. No mention of decades, no mention of endurance, and worse, sometimes their deaths were used politically. A former queen's death could be framed as closure, as proof that the old regime was truly gone. She has passed, officials would say, as one does, and that was that. But even in death, some women resisted erasure. They left instructions, burial preferences, requests for inscriptions. Some asked to be buried with symbols of their former rank. Others rejected them entirely. Both choices were statements. And sometimes even these wishes were ignored, because control, once lost, is rarely returned. Now let's talk about something softer. Friendship. Royal women were not raised to form friendships easily. Relationships were hierarchical, strategic. But exile changed that. Some former queens formed deep friendships later in life, with ladies-in-waiting, with fellow exiles, with religious women. These friendships were intense because they were chosen, and they mattered more than titles ever had. Letters between these women are tender, playful, sometimes even funny. They joked about aches, about memory lapses, about how absurd everything now seemed, and for brief moments they were just people, not symbols, not reminders, just women, talking. Now let's slow the pace even further, because the final years of these lives are especially quiet. Former queens in extreme old age often became physically smaller, weaker, less visible. They sat near windows, listened to sounds, watched seasons change. They rarely spoke about politics anymore. Politics had taken enough. Instead, they spoke about food they remembered, places they missed, people long dead. Memory became less chronological, more emotional. They forgot names but remembered feelings, fear, pride, loneliness, and sometimes peace. Yes, peace did happen. Not often, but sometimes. A few women reached a point where the loss no longer burned. It simply was. They accepted that their lives had been strange, unfair, unfinished, and acceptance is not resignation, it's rest. Now let's bring this gently toward the end of another long stretch. What we've really been watching is the slow dismantling of identity. Royal women were constructed by systems larger than themselves, and when those systems collapsed, the women had to live among the ruins. Some rebuilt small shelters, some wandered, some sat and waited. None of them escaped unchanged, and history, impatient as ever, rarely waited with them. So, if you're sleepy now, good. That means the rhythm is working. We're not heading toward a conclusion yet, just another gentle continuation. In the next part, we'll linger on something history rarely allows these women to have, a voice, a little longer, a little clearer.